A most wonderful good evening, ladies and gentlemen. As always, it's a pleasure to see everyone and welcome to the community and the extended community for another fascinating and very, very relevant evening that we'll be sharing called Vaccination Nation. Vaccinations are certainly something which should be on everyone's mind and on everyone's radar. Those who are on here who have already had the opportunity to receive their first vaccination, Yashikayach, well done to you. For those of you who have not yet received, I certainly hope that you will be able to in the very near future. Tonight is going to be an opportunity for us to hear from experts from the Jewish understanding of the role of vaccinations and its significance, historic origins as well as also hearing about what's been taking place in Israel, their rollout, the advent of how they have managed to vaccinate in such a prolific way, as well as hearing some of the results of what has been happening based upon the world catching up with the amazing accomplishments that Israel is currently doing. This will also be an opportunity for you to ask your questions as well towards the end of the evening. The evening will be divided into two parts, and I want to take this opportunity first to welcome our two presenters that are here. The first presenter is journalist Nathan Jeffay. Nathan has been at the forefront of covering as a journalist the vaccination program in Israel, the subject of Israel, as well as current events in many different countries across the US, UK, Australia, and further beyond are all things which are Nathan's speciality, and he has had the vantage point of seeing the coronavirus as it's broken out in Israel and is also their approach to it. And we're very much looking forward to hearing from him how all of it is taking place and what we in the UK can learn from the experiences of Eretz Yisrael, of Medinat Yisrael. We also have, as well this evening, my very good friend, Rabbi Dr. Moshe Freedman. Some people say that he is the United Synagogue's answer to Professor Whitty, but perhaps that's a bit of an exaggeration. He is the deputy co-chair of MEAG, and MEAG stands for the Moral and Ethical Advisory Group, which has looked after, from an ethical and moral point of view, pandemics, and obviously specifically COVID-19. Rabbi Freedman as well is the chaplain in Canary Wharf, and also the rabbi of New West End Synagogue. So we have really great people here this evening to present to us. And we're going to break down the presentations this evening. The first part will be Rabbi Freedman, who will take us through the Jewish philosophy and approach to the vaccination and what's taking place both in the past and also in current times as well. And following on, Nathan Jeffay will give us the insight what's happening in Israel, and then we'll open up to questions for everyone. It's going to be very, very exciting, and we're very much looking forward. So without further ado, I'm going to take this opportunity now on behalf of everyone to welcome Rabbi Freedman and to say what a delight it is to have you join us in Bushy Shul, and Yashikayach, and over to you. Thank you very much. Everyone, a virtual round of applause, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Rabbi Feldman. Wow, the United Synagogue's answer to Chris Whitty. That is one of the greatest compliments. Thank you so much. And it's a real pleasure to be joining you this evening. And it's wonderful to see so many people have turned out. So I want to take us back a few hundred years to the times before vaccinations. And in fact, during the last, well, probably thousands of years, humanity has faced issues with various different problems and pandemics and plagues and all sorts of things, but particularly the one that interests me the most is smallpox. Smallpox, we know, has been around since ancient Egypt. There are writings in China dating back hundreds of centuries. And what is fascinating about smallpox is that it was only recently eradicated in the late 70s and early 80s. And the original treatment for smallpox, as you probably know, was something called variolation. Now, variolation comes from the word variola, which is the name of the virus that, the two viruses that cause smallpox. Variolation was a technique that was used by barber surgeons going back many, many centuries, where they would take the pus from the pustules of someone who was suffering from smallpox and scratch it into the skin of healthy people in order to induce an immune response, although they didn't understand the immune system in the same way that we do now. They understood that this would possibly protect people against smallpox. It sounds barbaric compared to modern day standards, but this actually was relatively effective at the time. Around 1 in 1,000 people would contract smallpox and die from the process of variolation. And it was quite a controversial thing to do at the time, although it was the only response that, that doctors had. And at the time in London, there was a rabbi called Rabbi Avram ben Shlomo Hamburger, who served as a lay dayan in the Hambro synagogue under the tutelage of Chief Rabbi David Teveler Schiff. And he wrote a little book called Alei Trufa at the time. This was around the year 1785. And in it, he talks about the pain that he suffered over the loss of his 2 sons to smallpox. And he writes in this book that everyone should go out and get whatever funds they have available and pay for a barber surgeon to variolate you in order to protect you against smallpox. Because if you contracted smallpox naturally, you had about a 1 in 3 chance of survival. So the odds were either variolate and have a 1 in 1,000 chance of contracting smallpox, or on the other hand, take your risk, go out there into the big wide world where there's a smallpox pandemic on its way, and risk that sort of that much higher risk of a 1 in 3 chance. So clearly for him, he was very much an advocate of this rather ancient method of trying to protect other people. And it was at a time when variolation was quite controversial, because King George III had a son called Octavius, actually his 8th son, as you can probably tell from the name, who died from the process of variolation. He was one of those 1 in 1,000 who contracted smallpox and actually died. And yet here were our rabbinic leaders at the time trying to implore people to variolate. The Tiferet Yisrael, Rabbi Yisrael Lifshitz, at the time as well, also writes in his commentary to the Mishnah that variolation is something that everyone should do, because the odds are that you are highly susceptible to dying from smallpox, whereas variolation has a much smaller risk. Okay, and he writes in Tiferet Yisrael, he brings a number of different proofs, which I'm happy to share with you at another time. I'm not going to share the texts themselves with you because this evening, because we have a lot to get through. I think it'd be worth seeing them inside as well. If you're interested, I can share them with you. However, along comes a very famous British scientist called Edward Jenner. Edward Jenner is probably credited for saving more lives than I think possibly any other scientist. Possibly Louis Pasteur would be at the top of the list, but Edward Jenner was certainly in the top 10. And what did Edward Jenner discover? He noticed that milkmaids didn't contract smallpox, or if they did contract smallpox, they didn't die from it. They were much less likely to die. And that was possibly because they were exposed to a very similar virus called cowpox, which funnily enough affected cows. And what he did was he took some of the sample of cowpox from a milkmaid and injected it into the 9-year-old son of his gardener, and discovered that after exposing this young boy to people that had smallpox, the young boy was not affected whatsoever. And although, again, they didn't understand the full idea of an immune response and what had actually happened physiologically, Edward Jenner had discovered the first vaccine. And for those people who love Latin, you'll know that the word vaccine comes from the Latin vacca, which means a cow. Not everyone was convinced, and there are some wonderful cartoons from the time of people being vaccinated, turning into cows, and images of the golden calf and all those sorts of things. In 1801, when he finally published his results, there were anti-vax movements even at that time. But look at what the Tiferet Yisrael, our rabbi that we just mentioned before, look what he says about him. He says, we have righteous among the Gentiles who have a share in the world to come, and see that even without a connection to Torah, without the holy voice of our rabbis, he writes, may their memory be blessed, who would know that they'd be able to find such incredible advances from their own intellect? And he talks about the pious ones that have come into this world and mentions Edward Jenner by name, and credits him for saving myriads of people. Mentions him alongside Francis Drake, who brought the potato to Europe, and Johannes Gutenberg, who invented the printing press. This is how important the rabbinic leadership at the time saw the advancement in medicine, and recognized the importance of saving lives. And of course, if you look at the data from what happened after Edward Jenner's concept of vaccination was rolled out across the world, we have data, funny enough, from Sweden going back all the way to the 1700s of smallpox cases. And you can see from the data various different outbreaks taking place. And as soon as the 19th century hits, you see those cases flatten all the way through until the 1980 or so, when the World Health Organization declared smallpox as basically extinct. Okay, there were minor outbreaks, but they happened in laboratories, and they were very controlled. Okay, so what about the rabbinic response to plagues in the past? Because we've had cholera epidemics, we've had the Black Plague, we've had smallpox, we've had various other plagues as well. And rabbis have always written about the correct response, and they've written from a position of halakha, not from personal opinion. So the Gemara itself talks about how if there's a plague in the city, you have to limit the time that you spend outdoors, because there was a recognition even before modern medicine and modern science understood the mechanism by which plagues were transmitted. There was a recognition that there was a danger of mixing with other people and going out. Okay, there's a comment in the Gemara that that Rava, the sage from the time of the Gemara, would limit his going out, and he would close the windows of his house in order to make sure that the air from the street didn't sort of waft in and bring the contagions with it. So what is the imperative to protect life? Because we're used to the idea of talking about pikuach nefesh, saving life, you know, being able to break Shabbat to save a life, that life is the most important principle, saving life, protecting life. So where does this come from? So it comes from the Torah directly. It says, Rak yishom elecha u'shmor nafshecha ma'od pen tishkach es hadvarim asher ro'u einecha ufen yasuru milvavacha kol yemei chayecha v'hoidatem levavecha levanecha v'livnei vonecha. So what is this referring to? It says, but beware and watch yourself very well, lest you forget the things that your eyes saw, and lest the things that depart from your heart and all the days of your life, that you should make them known to your children and your children's children. Now, on the face of it, this looks like a verse in Devarim, which is talking about protecting ourselves from forgetting the experience of Sinai. It's a spiritual protection rather than a physical one. But many of the Meforshim, the Kli Yakar, the Rambam, actually look at the nuances in this text and point out that there is in fact an imperative not only to guard one's spiritual life, one's ability to perform mitzvot, to remember the mitzvot from Torah and remember Ma'amad Har Sinai and the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai, but also to protect life itself, to protect ourselves. The Be'er HaGoyla cites in Choshen Mishpat, says that we have to protect ourselves from harm, and that God has given us our bodies, not because he wants to give us them for, you know, our bodies for us to do what we like with, but in order that we protect ourselves. And someone who endangers their life it's like you've been given a gift and you're destroying that gift, you're throwing it back, which is why we have to protect ourselves and not take unnecessary risks. Okay, there is also an importance of protecting others. Sefer Hasidim writes that one should not put a stumbling block in front of the blind. Okay, it's a verse in Vayikra. It says what this means is that if you know that you're suffering from an infectious disease, you should limit your interaction with other people. He talks about skin diseases and things that could be passed on through community transmission, through being in contact with people. But this applies in all sorts of possibilities of transmission, whether it's through contact, direct contact with people, whether it's through being close to people, breathing over them, droplets, those sorts of things. It applies in all scenarios. So in that case, anything that we can do to protect ourselves, which goes within the boundaries of modern medicine, which is accepted in terms of a rigid and rigorous scientific analysis, which all of these vaccinations absolutely are, we have an obligation according to halakha and directly from the Torah to ensure that we are protected as much as possible against the virus, and therefore become vaccinated as soon as we possibly can. As soon as we have that opportunity, we should absolutely take it. And I believe it's the responsibility of rabbinic leadership, in our country and other countries as well, to do exactly what Rabbi Hamburger and Rabbi David Teveler Schiff did when they wrote Alei Tzurufah, to encourage people to get whatever medical intervention they can in order to protect life itself and to protect other people as well. Okay, I'll touch on some of the ethical points as well towards the end, because there are some interesting ethical points which I think are more general. But some other points about vaccination. There are some people who are concerned about what goes into vaccines. There are, as far as I know, in these particular vaccines, there are certainly no animal products. And whereas some vaccines, particularly against viruses, often use fetal cell lines in order to culture the vaccine in the first place, in order to culture the actual cells to make the vaccines in the first place. I'm not sure that these vaccines actually do. Some of them may do, but I'm not sure that they necessarily do. Even if they did, from a halachic perspective, we have no issue whatsoever using fetal cell lines, even though they were taken from fetuses that were aborted, I think in the 60s or 70s. And those cell lines are used to grow the virus in order to be able to then use it to make vaccinations. So we wouldn't have a problem with that, even if they were used. Although the more modern vaccines don't necessarily need to use that. The other big question about vaccination is porcine gelatin. Gelatin is used as a stabilizer in the process of making vaccinations. As far as I know, none of the vaccinations contain porcine gelatin. But again, even if they did, there is Reb Chaim Ozer Grozinski has a teshuvah about how when it comes to kashrut, to sort of summarize the teshuvah for you, it basically says, in order to transgress the laws of kashrut, the thing that you're taking has to actually be food, and you have to actually be eating it. Okay, so porcine medical products, whether it's some ingredient in a vaccine or a heart valve that's made from porcine material, none of those things would violate any of the laws of kashrut whatsoever. And a Jew is absolutely obligated, as I said, to protect life, and therefore absolutely obligated to get whatever help they can, even if it means using the a pig valve or for a heart valve, or in our case vaccination. What about hashkafa? What about Jewish philosophy, theology? What about someone who thinks they're really frum and has very strong faith in Hashem, and they says, you know what, Rabbi, okay, I get your point, but at the end of the day, I'm a very, very faithful Jew. I believe that God will protect me no matter what. I don't need doctors. I have such strong faith in God. And I even have a verse that can prove my point to you. It says in Tehillim, in Psalms, Shomer Pesayim Hashem Dolesi V'li Yoshia. Okay, the principle that says the Lord protects the simple. When I was poor, he saved me. In other words, Rabbi, I can go out and do whatever I want. If God wants to take me, he'll take me. And if God wants me to survive, I'll live. And Shomer Pesayim Hashem, I don't need any vaccinations. Okay, nothing could be further from the truth. The idea of Shomer Pesayim Hashem means that as we go through our lives, we're allowed to take risks that are taken by most people. Okay? And there are risks associated with everything in life. There's a risk associated with crossing the road, with getting into a car, with using public transport, with just being on the street. There are risks. If you ask an actuary, they'll tell you how many people die from mundane activities that we kind of do all of the time. There's risks associated with everything. And so when it comes to vaccination, one has to ask oneself, is this something that the scientific establishment is saying is the right thing to do? And what are the relative risks of vaccination? So in terms of vaccination today, there are often some mild side effects from vaccination, and you should certainly discuss with your doctor if you are worried about any of the medications you happen to be on or anything like that. The only group that should be concerned at all are groups of people either who can't be vaccinated for medical reasons, or because they've had some kind of allergic response to some of the ingredients in the vaccine. Okay? And there are sometimes alternatives anyway. But there are some people who might need to consider a conversation with their doctor about vaccination. But for the vast majority of us, that doesn't apply. And the risks are tiny, right? Reference back to the conversation we had about variolation, where the risk was 1 in 1,000. There is a tiny, minuscule risk when it comes to vaccination, possibly only even 1 in a million or more. And therefore, compared to not being vaccinated, to going out into the wide world and possibly exposing yourself naturally to a deadly virus, for us, it's just a simple assessment of relative risk. Is the risk of vaccination greater or smaller than the risk of not being vaccinated and going out and exposing ourselves to COVID-19? Clearly, it's significantly worse to not be vaccinated, to potentially put yourself in harm's way, be exposed to a virus that has taken tragically so many people. It is much better to be vaccinated. And from a halachic perspective, it is an absolute imperative to do so. So says, by the way, Rav Herschel Schachter from Yeshiva University, when there were comments about, the sort of coronavirus vaccine being, almost like experimental, because it seemed like these vaccines have been sort of rushed out, and that normally it would take 10 years to make a vaccine, and now we've managed to rush them out within a year. So how has that happened? So the truth is, what's actually been sped up is a lot of the red tape and bureaucracy, and or I shouldn't say bureaucracy, it's possibly a little bit pejorative, but the sort of processes, the hoops that companies have to go through, that pharmacy companies have to go through in order to actually get approval for any kind of drugs or treatments, that has been sped up. But the scientific process, the studies that have been done, the processes that have taken place in order to make sure that these vaccines are safe, that has been absolutely rigorous. And the reason that it's taken less time is because biomedical scientists have been doing practically nothing else, because everyone wants to get the vaccines out, partly because they're going to save a lot of lives. And obviously there's also a commercial reason to make sure that your vaccine is out there and being bought by governments and so on and so on. So, I mean, for example, if I suddenly said, we've all got to get ready for Pesach, and it's going to be in a week's time, okay, it's not in a week's time, don't worry. But if I said we all have to get ready for Pesach now, and it's going to take you a week, okay? Now, normally, if it takes you 4 weeks to get ready for Pesach, could you do it in a week? We probably could. If we worked hard enough, we probably could. And we've got more time than that, so don't worry. But if we dropped everything else and got help in and did our best to get things going as quickly as possible, we could probably do it. Same thing with coronavirus vaccines. That's what's been going on. Everyone has been focusing on that. I know people involved in medical trials, and that's what they have told me has been going on. Everyone was focusing on making sure that the vaccines were tested and safe and rolled out as quickly as possible. Okay, so in terms of some of the ethical issues with vaccination, there are some interesting questions that come up which relate to whether one can choose not to be vaccinated. And that's an interesting one, because as I said, there is a halachic imperative to vaccinate, and I believe that we all should get vaccinated as soon as possible. But what if someone decides, well, at the end of the day, if everyone else gets vaccinated, then there's this thing called herd immunity. So I don't need to get vaccinated myself, because I can sort of rely on the fact that other people won't be transmitting the virus. Okay, yeah, fine. So that's a very selfish position to take. If you're one of those people that can't be vaccinated because of a medical condition that prevents that, then herd immunity is the thing that you rely on in order to be able to live a normal life. But to say that I won't get a vaccine because I don't want to, or because I am not interested in doing that because I don't feel I need to, because I'll take my risk, is perhaps a little bit of a sort of morally questionable thing to do. Now, it does make a difference as to whether the vaccinations not only protect against mortality and morbidity, so how ill a person would get if they did catch coronavirus, compared to whether it also prevents against transmission. Because the ethical question in the first scenario, where a vaccine prevents from morbidity and mortality, that is much more of a personal question, a personal choice, okay? And the societal good that I do by being vaccinated is relatively small compared to a case where vaccinations also prevent transmission. So if a vaccine prevents transmission, then it's not just a personal choice that I'm making, but it's a societal good that we all become vaccinated, because then we're also preventing the virus from being transmitted among a population. So you not only have the side of halakha that says we have to protect ourselves, which would be dubious to ignore, but you also have an obligation, as we said before, to protect others as well. And the data that seems to be coming out from Israel and from the various studies that are going on the effectiveness of the vaccinations looks very promising, that it does appear to prevent transmission as well, at least to a certain point, in which case there is an even greater halachic imperative to become vaccinated. Okay, now we haven't touched on a number of other areas, such as Dina D'Machos Dina, the idea of following the law of the land, the imperative to follow the government's laws and guidelines when it comes to social distancing and so on. Those are all imperatives as well. And I can tell you absolutely now, I am grateful for the Chief Rabbi for speaking out on all accounts, both in promoting vaccination and also protecting his community and being a light and a beacon for rabbinic leadership across the world in speaking out about the importance of adhering to government guidelines in every way. I'm grateful to Rabbonim in America and in Israel for doing the same. You have, as I said, Rav Herschel Schachter in America. You have Rabbonim in Israel, such as Rav Asher Weiss, many, many others as well. And that, I believe passionately, is the right position to take. We all have a responsibility to encourage one another to do the right thing, to get vaccinated as quickly as possible, to continue the very difficult and painful process of social distancing and having to not do the things that we want to do to protect other people, and remember the very critical and tragic catastrophic consequences that can take place if we fail to do that. So I think I've made my position as clear as possible. I hope I've given you some sources as well to take home. If you want any of those, I'm happy to share them with you in writing as well. But it's my great honor to hand back to Rabbi Feldman, and I look forward to your questions later on.
All right, Freedman, thank you very much. So I assume you're quite neutral on the subject of vaccines based upon the presentation that you've given, but it really is fantastic having you, not just as a friend, but as such a great spokesperson and representative and ambassador for us within the government, within the UK, also of stating the importance of carrying that strong Jewish voice of the importance of adhering to all social distancing requirements, playing our part, and also, of course, getting vaccinated. So thank you very much for your presentation. We look forward to the questions that you'll be presented with in short order as well. Moving on now to Israel. It's really great that we are privileged to have Nathan Jeffay with us here this evening, who has been living and breathing the pandemic, hopefully from a social distance point of view. But over to you, Nathan, what's going on in Israel?
Very good evening, Rabbi Feldman, and everybody who's with us. It's great to be with you. It's very exciting indeed. And I'm going to talk about a few different aspects of what's going on here in Israel. I'm actually going to share my screen, if that's okay with everybody. Could you tell me when you can see the screen? Can you see the screen now? You can see?
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. Okay. So I'm happy to report that 3 weeks ago, after reporting on this pandemic this has been living and breathing, as you said, for the best part of a year. Last February, this time last year, I was a journalist covering politics, diplomacy, basically writing about elections, because we have lots and lots of elections here in Israel. I've covered numerous elections during the time we've been here. And then life just changed, and I got a phone call saying, is it possible that you would be the coronavirus correspondent for Times of Israel? And I thought, that's a peculiar thing to ask. Who has a correspondent just to cover one disease? Who has a correspondent just to cover one virus? How big is this virus really going to be? That's what we would have all thought last February, right? And it turns out that soon enough, I was just basically leading the whole of the news team in our exploration of this virus, because every single story was about coronavirus. So after covering this for all of these months, it was with great excitement that I actually went 3 weeks ago along and received my own vaccine and said the blessing Shechechayanu v'kimanu v'higyanu lazman hazeh. And tomorrow I will go and have my second shot. And as we do when we have a better wine than we had just before, say another bracha, which is Hatov v'Hametiv. And that will be my vaccination process completed. A week later, my immunity will kick in. And it's difficult to describe the sense of excitement here in Israel about all of this, because while we're battling the rising coronavirus case numbers and the variants, one of which you've been kind enough to export to us from the United Kingdom, thank you very much. While we're battling all of this and the case numbers are rising, we do have this hope of the vaccination. So we're really feeling great excitement and, on the other hand, concern, and with mixed emotions every single day here in Israel. And I want to explore with you a little bit of what's been going on here over the last few weeks. And not forgetting, while we speak about all of this, that the Israeli vaccine is still in progress as well. It's very easy to forget that, but Israel is still developing a vaccine. And maybe if you have questions later, one of the things that we'll come on to, why it's actually still valuable and still relevant for the Israeli vaccine. So let's get started on some of this. Rabbi Feldman, just give me a nod if you can hear okay. Is the audio okay? Excellent, okay. So the vaccination drive started on December the 19th. And I must tell you, even though I've been reporting all of this stuff and reported every single detail of when would vaccines arrive, when would all of this start, how would it all work, I did not expect things to get started with such force, with such intensity. When it all started on December 19th, I thought it would be a relatively slow start. It was not. On December 19th, the Prime Minister received his vaccine. The next morning, the President received his vaccine. And from then, it was go with major intensity. And I think there's something really important here in the fact that the Prime Minister and the President went first, because we're not going to get into politics this evening. We're not going to get into politics and what anyone thinks of the Prime Minister, of the President. But obviously people found themselves asking, hey, you know, these guys want to go first. Is that a publicity stunt, them stealing the limelight? Or is that something which is positive and which is going to help the nation? And what we saw was that in a very real sense, it was the latter. It was the latter. Whether you agree with Benjamin Netanyahu on politics or disagree with him, irrelevant of that, it was leading by personal example. And I think there's something intensely Jewish about that. At the time when this was happening, my mind constantly went to the story of the splitting of the Red Sea, and Nachshon, who went in to the sea and is given such honor in the Mishnah for doing this, for going into the dry Red Sea and being the leader and showing the people that it could be done. Because I'm not suggesting that there was any sense of danger in taking these vaccines, but it's a psychological milestone that the nation had to get to. And by the leaders going first, by the leaders leading, unlike in other countries where the leaders were slower to get going, I think that was a massively important step and a massively important personal example, which really got things started with major force. And senior doctors went then. And I think this kind of really launched the snowball effect that we have seen since then. So since our leaders became vaccinated, we have 3.2 million Israelis who have received a first dose, which is really phenomenal, because if you think about it, Israel has a population of about 9 million people, but the vaccine has only been approved for over 16-year-olds. And Kanei Nahara, Israel is a very young nation. We have lots of children, about 30% children. So we're not really aiming at the moment for a target of 9 million people. We're aiming for far fewer. And the fact that 3.2 million people have already received a first shot That is phenomenal. That shows that they are committed to the process. They will be taking their second shot, and they will be getting protection from the vaccine over the coming weeks. And that the rate that we're talking about there is remarkable. Almost 2 million people have received a second dose as well. So those people, and we'll see in a moment just where we stand exactly, those people are basically either at protection or headed towards protection. Israel is leading the world. We have 1.7% of the population getting a shot daily. Well, in the UK, no disrespect, of course, to the UK, it's important, and there is progress in the UK, but just for a comparison without a value judgment, in the UK it's 0.58%, and in the US it's 0.41%. And you'll see there a graph which just really gives you a sense of just the extent to which Israel is steaming ahead of all of this. And I'm sure that's a great source of pride to everyone who's on the call this evening. Now, we're all aware that one of the most important challenges of the vaccination drive is to get those people 60 plus, I would say elderly, but I don't think 60 plus is classed as elderly today at all, not in the slightest, but to get the 60 plus age group immunized, that is the major priority. Interestingly, there were discussions as all of this was unfolding, is that actually the best path? I interviewed some experts who said, actually, maybe we should be vaccinating the young super spreaders first, because maybe we need to vaccinate, first of all, those people who could spread to the largest degree the virus. But the consensus pretty much has been vaccinate the 60 plus, because they are most likely to end up in hospital. They are most likely to have morbidity as a result of the coronavirus. Therefore, the vaccine should be given to them first. And this has very much been the priority. 81% of 60 plus are either immunized, developing immunity. So immunized, we're talking about have had their vaccinations. This figure also includes those who have recovered from the coronavirus, or with developing immunity at least 2 weeks after their second shot, 81%. And you can see a chart there which shows the age groups and how their vaccinations have gone. The lighter color is the first dose, the darker color is the second dose. So here I want to look at what's actually the key to the success. What has made Israel able to do this? And I want to focus briefly on 5 different factors. First of all, we have a strong and excellent supply of vaccines. The supply of vaccines has been very, very plentiful. And you'll all probably know that one of the reasons for this is that the vaccine companies are really excited to get vaccines to Israel. And there is nothing untoward about this. There is nothing dodgy about this. There is nothing questionable about this. This is a compliment to the way that things work in Israel, because for the vaccine companies, by sending large and selling, of course, it's a financial transaction, but by selling large numbers of vaccines to Israel very quickly, they're sending them to an advanced medically advanced society that can get these vaccines out there very quickly and can also provide excellent record keeping on exactly what's happening after people have received these vaccines. And that does 2 things for the companies. First of all, by sending these to Israel, by Israel getting vaccinated, it shows the world that actually this is possible, how this can work, and it's basically an excellent example of what vaccination can do for a society. And we'll come on to that a little bit more afterward. Second of all, the excellent record keeping of Israel's health system means that we can get loads of statistics on how vaccines are behaving on the ground, and we're going to come on to that as well. So that's a motivating factor for the companies. Second of all, the health system. Israel's health system is very efficient, very efficient. It has had lacking investment in recent years, but still very efficient. And the fascinating thing about it is that it has probably the best of the American style and the British style of healthcare, because it is public funded. It is funded by government, and it is mostly funded by government, and it is free at the point of service, just like the kind of healthcare that we used to in Britain, the kind of healthcare that I grew up with in Britain. So free healthcare available to everybody, publicly funded. So none of the drawbacks of private healthcare to get vaccinations out there. On the other hand, you don't get provision from a single organization. There is not a single organization, but rather there are 4 what we call kupot cholim, so 4 healthcare organizations, and everybody in Israel chooses which one of these 4 healthcare organizations they're going to belong to. So what we get is we get a bit of competition between these 4 healthcare organizations. They're all competing with each other to do this best, to do this in the most effective and efficient way to get the vaccinations out there. So in terms of the health system, the best of free healthcare with that bit of competition has made it really, really efficient. Third of all, we have strong infrastructure. How do we get these vaccines around the country to where they need to go with the super cold storage, all of these logistical challenges? We have here a load of ex-military people who have these excellent infrastructure skills as well as the actual infrastructure. Fourthly, we have a very motivated population. When Israelis decide that they're going to do something, as you probably know, they do it and they get on with it and they do it quickly and they don't dither about their decisions, and people decide they're going to get vaccinated. We're going to get vaccinated now. We want an appointment now. Let's get on with it. And it happens straight away. People get to it. People get their vaccines. And the 5th here is friar fear. What is a friar? Anyone know what a friar is? Friar is the Israeli term for sucker, for somebody who gets left behind, for somebody who misses out, for somebody who loses out. And in the Israeli mentality, everybody is scared of being the friar, of being the person who's left behind, which sometimes isn't the nicest quality of Israelis, but in this instance, it's been great because no one wants to get left behind. No one wants to get to the clinic and find out, they've just run out of the vaccines. So this actually caused an enormous rush of people calling up to get their appointments because no one wanted to be left behind. Everybody wanted to be the first. Everybody wanted to be the first to get that photograph on Facebook and say, hey, I'm vaccinated. People didn't want to be left behind, and that's actually helped develop this momentum in Israel's vaccination. Any questions to this point? We're going to have a round of questions afterwards, but if anyone has anything burning that they want to ask, feel free to chime in. Otherwise, I will continue. What is the hope of all of this for Israel? Well, the hope is pretty clear, or at least the hope was pretty clear when we started out on this, because as you all know, it feels like the goalposts of this pandemic are moving. With the emergence of variants that spread faster, it feels like we knew what we were doing, that we're heading towards herd immunity, and then everything's being changed because can you get to herd immunity? We've got the variants that are more spready, that are more catchy. It makes it more difficult, and we're dealing with all of that at the moment. We're dealing with all of that. Will vaccines get us as fast as we hoped through the pandemic? But let's put that aside for a moment. Maybe we'll come to that in questions. In general, the vision here is vaccines for all citizens over the age of 16 by the end of March. That is a remarkable, remarkable aim. And if Israel achieves that, whether it's classed officially as herd immunity or not, that will be phenomenal. And the second element that I just wanted to put up here, because I think that for everybody in the Jewish world, it was a major psychological kind of drain the sense that we had to celebrate Seder night last year alone. I think that kind of the many things that kind of were the memorable moments in the pandemic, and give me a nod if you had this feeling. I think these small Seders, celebrating without our families, I think that was very difficult for everyone, and that was a big psychological moment. And the dream of, we say every year, L'Shana Haba B'Yerushalayim. This year, we hope L'Shana Haba, that this year, not L'Shana Haba, Shana Hazeh, Zot, we will celebrate with our families. And this is exactly what the Prime Minister said. When we ask on Seder night why this night is different, we'll say everything has changed, that we are emerging or have emerged from the pandemic, and that's the big hope that Israelis are still carrying around. What about the hope for the world? Here I have the light at the end of the tunnel, because I think that in a sense, what's happening, and again, I give the caveat that we don't know exactly where these variants are taking us, so we can't state anything with certainty, but if there is a light at the end of this tunnel, it seems that Israel is helping the world to see this by steaming forward with this vaccination campaign. And how is Israel doing that? First of all, in very simple terms, showing it's practical. Showing it is practical. Showing that it's not something to be scared of, and we'll come to that in a second as well, but showing that this can be done. And it was so fascinating for me when I went to an Arab town in Israel and started interviewing people there about vaccinations, and people said to me, you know what, at first we were nervous to take the vaccines, but then we saw that the Israeli Jewish people are taking the vaccines, and we know how careful the Jewish people are in Israel. This was their phrasing, not mine, about health, about all of these things, and that made us feel confident. And I think there is a sense there that people know that Israelis are very health conscious, very cautious about taking risks, don't take unnecessary risks, apart from if you're on vacation and you go skydiving and that kind of thing, but don't tend to take unnecessary risks. And I think that around the world, if people see Israelis heading to vaccination clinics, it helps them to get over a psychological barrier themselves. Second of all, Israel is giving a sense of what the side effects are. It's mind-boggling when you look at the numbers of how many Israelis are being vaccinated and how many Israelis we're getting data for all the time, compared to how many people got vaccinated in the clinical trials. It's absolutely mind-boggling. It's so many times the numbers. Israel is like a real-world laboratory. And Israel is looked to show what the side effects are, and also, thirdly, to show that the vaccines actually work. If they're working in Israel, other people relax because we get the sense that they're working elsewhere. And so what are the results that we're getting so far? And this is the really exciting thing, I must tell you. There is hardly any experience that has been as exhilarating as a journalist as getting the figures delivered to my phone, the very latest figures as they come out by the researchers on how people are responding to the vaccine, hundreds of thousands of people, how they're actually responding, and knowing that people around the world are waiting, governments around the world are waiting to see these figures from Israel to understand how much they should be excited about the vaccine. I can't tell you the enthusiasm there is for these figures. One of the articles that I wrote about these figures was shared 110,000 times. Shared 110,000 times. I don't take that as any self-glory. It's nothing to do with me. It's nothing to do with my writing style. It is simply that people are desperate to get this information because it indicates to the rest of the world how well these vaccines will perform. 92% efficiency. I use the word efficiency because that's the word that we use. We use different phrasing when we're talking about in trials. When we're talking about actual performance, we should actually be using the term effectiveness. That's actually the correct word to be using here. The vaccine is 92% effective in the first controlled result outside of trials. So what that means is the first real data on people getting the vaccine in real life and comparing that with a set of people similar age, similar health who didn't get the vaccine, we're seeing that it's 92% effective. And given that the trials expected 95%, that's well within the margin of error. That is reassuring to the whole world that these vaccines work. Second of all, 60% drop in hospitalizations for age 60 plus, 3 weeks after the first shot. So that's even before people have had the second shot. We're seeing a big decrease in hospitalizations for the 60 plus age group, which we are most concerned about. And the latest from this week, under 0.3% of Israelis are reporting side effects to the doctors. So obviously, many, many more people are feeling a bit fluey or having an arm which is in pain, that kind of thing. But we're worried about serious, or we're not worried. The concern is serious side effects. And what we're seeing here is that there is a minute percentage of side effects filtering through to the medical system, 0.3%. And of those, most of those are very, very mild and pass very quickly. So that's really important data. And I'd like to finish, and we're going to move to questions very shortly. I'd like to finish with these thoughts, which is really a thought process that I've been going through as I've been doing all of this coverage, looking on a level of what's actually motivating Israel. What's actually kind of making us so determined to do this? And I've come up with a few things, which I think that there's this national bounce back ethos in Israel, an ethos of, you know, whatever life throws at us, we will bounce back, we'll find a way through it. Our national strength is getting back on our feet. We've had intifadas, we've had wars, we've had all sorts of things, and we always get back on our feet. And with the pandemic, it will be the same. And if it's a military issue, we go to the military. If it's a medical issue, we go to the doctors. We put our trust in the doctors, and we will do that to bounce back. Second of all, I think we have a small nation syndrome, which is that when you've got 9 million people, it's less daunting than having a huge country where you need to source a huge number of vaccines. And there's a sense of, okay, sometimes it works against us being so small. On this occasion, it works for us. We can secure what the companies regard as being a relatively small number of vaccines, and we can really have very large achievements with that small number of vaccines. And I think the sense that Israel is a small, close-knit nation is really helpful in that respect. There is the medical excellence. I touched on this before. Now, I'm not talking just about those healthcare organizations, but broader medical excellence, which really means that we have not just the ability to get these shots administered very quickly and very effectively, but it's also to do with the trust that people have in doctors, the trust that people have in the medical system, and trust towards doctors is very, very high. Of course, it's very high. Everyone wants their son or daughter to be a doctor. You trust doctors, of course. But we really trust doctors here, and that's extremely helpful in this campaign. I should say, by the way, just as an interesting side note, that just as Jewish parents want their children to be doctors, Arab parents very much want their children to be doctors as well. And there is an Arab town that has, I think, the highest proportion of doctors anywhere in the world. So that element of kind of trust in doctors and admiration for doctors spans both Jews and Arabs. And the fourth thing and the last thing that I want to touch on for now is actually the reason that I chose this particular photograph for this slide. This is a photograph that I took when I was in Nepal after the earthquake. This photograph I took in Kathmandu. And I went there to report, to write about the Israeli field hospital that was established there in order to help people, in order to help local Kathmandu people after this terrible earthquake. And during that entire journey to and from Kathmandu, which I made to write for various news organizations, including the British Medical Journal, about the after effects of the earthquake, what was constantly in my mind was that for Israelis, life is so sacred. It's so sacred. It's so important. The saving of life, the preservation of life. You'll see, look at these guys here in this photograph. Here you have a medical clown. Israel didn't just send a medical team out, they also sent medical clowns to take care of the psychological and spiritual and mental well-being of the people there. And this really emphasized the sacredness of life to Israel, going so far in order to look after the lives of other people. And this same phenomenon, this same idea, this same set of ideals is definitely here in this vaccination drive. The sense that life is so sacred and so important that whatever we can do, and here, I guess we relate back to what our previous presenter was saying, we do whatever we can in order to preserve and to safeguard life, and to do that as quickly as possible, because every day that's lost, every hour that's lost in this vaccination campaign takes lives, and we can't afford to do that. And I think in this idea, and that's why I wanted to leave it here, I think in this idea, we have the sense that Israel is not just doing something that's practically so important, but is also, in a sense, performing a Kiddush Hashem, a sanctification of God's name, and really being a light unto the nations.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Nathan. Really, really, what a great way to end on a high. If I could ask if you could just stop sharing your screen for a moment, which would be great. And I'm going to bring on to the screen as well. So if you could stop sharing for...
I'm just trying the, here we go. Yep.
Brilliant. Okay, bring on as well Rabbi Freedman. And now really is an opportunity for everyone to take the presentations both from the ethical, moral, halachic Jewish side, as well as the good practice which is going on in Israel as well, and also some of the ramifications, hopefully the positive ones, which can be shared in the diaspora communities. Also really fantastic presentations from both sides. So let's take this opportunity to field some questions. The easiest way to field questions is to raise your hand virtually, which you're able to do through the participant section. You can also ask your question in the chat box. If you need to call out your question as well, that's also okay. We're going to start with Stephen Herman. If that's okay, if you can unmute yourself, please, to share your question with our presenters, and you could choose who you're going to ask to, or to both of them as well.
Well, first of all, thank you very much to both speakers for superb presentations. It's really very interesting. I just wanted to ask Nathan Jeffay if the religious leaders were also amongst the first in Israel to publicize their receipt of the vaccine.
Yes, there were, the health ministry approached various rabbis and said, would you please do a very public vaccination? And there were many who accepted that opportunity. With some, it took a little bit more time. And that was, I think that was, it did take a little bit more time to convince some of them than the leaders hoped. But I think the proof of the pudding is in the eating. And what we see in statistics that came out this week is that I mentioned before that 81% of the 60+ age group is either has immunity already, or is well on the road to that immunity. The figure among the ultra-Orthodox population, I don't have a figure for other Orthodox, but among the ultra-Orthodox or Haredi population, the figure is, I think, 72% or 73% today, which is lower, but you would expect it to be lower because people are that little bit more hesitant, but is not kind of, any significant concern. It's not, people were worried that, in the religious community, people might be very, very slow, very nervous, very hesitant. Some people following anti-vaxxers in America, for example, but absolutely that hasn't been the case. So yes, rabbis did show leadership, but the important thing all of these weeks on is that people are going and vaccinating. There's some areas where that needs to be strengthened, but people are actually going.
Thank you, Stephen, very much. And over to you, Stuart. Please come on in.
Thank you
as well.
Thank you, gentlemen, for two very interesting presentations. Great to see Israel leading the way, and I hope the rest of the world is listening and watching as well and learning something from it. Can I just ask Nathan yourself, you talked about 92% effectiveness, the test-controlled results outside the trial, the first ones ever. Is that after the first or the second vaccine, or where does that stand in terms of that measurement? When people have had the second jab or after the first jab?
Yeah, the 92% figure is people who have been at least a week after their second injection, which is when Pfizer says that the immunity kicks in. And the way that they got those figures is really the same way that they did it in the trial, which is by monitoring that number of people, a certain number of people, and having a control group, so by looking at a load of other people as well. And the reason that was really easy in Israel is because they have the digital medical records of everybody, so all they really needed to do was to see how many people have tested positive among those who got the vaccine and among those who haven't got the vaccine.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Stuart. Thank you very much. Handing over now to Stephen. So let me bring you on over here for your question as well.
Thank you, Rabbi. This question is directed to Rabbi Freedman. When I saw this talk coming on, one of the things that has been worrying me recently, in the UK particularly, is the behaviour of some of the strictly Orthodox Jewish population of perhaps North London as in question. And yet I heard you eloquently speak about halalic imperative, and indeed Nathan was talking about the preservation of life being so important. And yet it strikes me that this sector don't appear to be adhering to any of the tenets that you are promoting. And it worries me as a Jew, and as a Jew in the UK, and putting the political ramifications to one side, and the what's your view on this? How do we, and indeed in Israel as well, as we've seen in the news, how do we go about talking to these people? And perhaps the question I should be asking is, how do we get these people to comply for their own safety and, of course, the safety of others? Because it seems that they're being very selfish, and I'm quite embarrassed as a Jew about this. I don't know what your opinion is on that.
Thank you, Stephen. I had expected this question to come up. I would share your concerns, and I also feel very hurt. I feel very upset about what I've read. I think we should put it into context. It's not the entire Haredi community. We shouldn't tar everyone with the same brush. There are many people who I know personally who are also equally upset about the behavior of members of their own communities. And also there are many other people out there and other groups, religious, cultural groups, who are also indulging in things that they shouldn't be. But I think the problem is particularly acute in certain pockets of the Haredi community, and I think there are a number of reasons for it. Primarily, I think the reason is a community one and a cultural one. I don't think people are thinking about it as deeply as we have this evening. I think there's a lot of peer pressure. We normally think of peer pressure as something that affects younger people, but actually it affects everybody, you know, keeping up with the Joneses and that kind of thing. Within the Haredi community, from those who I've spoken to, for example, it's all about shidduchim. It's all about, you know, getting your kids into the right schools and conforming to the community norms and the pressure that gets put on people. You can imagine in a community where smachot are so important, and who marries who, and being seen in the right place, and so on, the community pressures become very great. I also happen to think that there are deeper hashkafic issues, which Rabbi Dr. Natan Slifkin wrote very eloquently about in the Jewish Chronicle recently. I would advise you to read that as well, which will give you a good background although he does have a particular perspective, and it's not a very pretty one. I would like to paint a slightly better picture. There are very good people across the Jewish community, and I include the Haredi community in that as well, particularly in this country, who have done great things and are doing the right thing. But of course, it's always the few that let the side down. And I don't know what the answer is, because if I thought I had an in with getting people to do the right thing, I wouldn't be here. I'd be over there trying to get people to get vaccinated and adhere to social distancing rules. I think the solution has to come from the top, and that's something that unfortunately is slightly above my pay grade. But I do hope that they start to listen to the advice very soon.
Well, Stephen, I think what you're hearing from Rabbi Freedman is there's a lot of pain that he and he's a very controlled person, but there is a lot of pain because we care deeply about all of our brethren, and we really want them to be on the same page as us and taking the same approach, and not all of them are, and that is very painful, and we are all aware of the consequences. Somehow that has to be navigated, and it's not simple. It really isn't. But we all are part of the Jewish people, and that comes with the consequence of us feeling very deeply hurt when not everyone lives up to what they should be living up to. But Stephen, thank you very much for the question. I believe that Peter Hammerman, are you looking to ask a question as well?
Yes, please. This is mainly to Nathan for the simple reason, and by the way, thanks for two very interesting presentations. Mainly to Nathan because Israel will be fully vaccinated well before the UK. The question is, when Israel gets to that point, can Israelis throw caution to the wind and start travelling again, or how does it play out from there when there's full vaccination?
Sure, I think that's the question that every Israeli is asking at the moment, and I spent several hours today interviewing an epidemiologist on exactly this question, and the disappointing answer is we really don't know. Because, as I mentioned before, it feels like the goalposts are moving, because we did have a sense, and we all thought we were going to get green passports that you could travel around if you're vaccinated. And then these variants come out, and it's really thrown everything up, because we just don't know anymore the extent to which everyone will be protected, what it will take to get herd immunity. What is likely is that there will still be precautions in place, and we will be wearing masks for quite a while, and we will be more careful about social conduct. But what I expect to happen is that vaccinated people do mix with other vaccinated people. And I think you asked about traveling, and specifically, I think we will see Israelis traveling. I think we will see Israelis traveling overseas, going to see family, and very much hoping to restart the tourist industry as well. I think this will be a major priority as soon as we've got some reassurance that the variants are in some type of control, which I hope will happen. I think that Israel will be very keen to welcome tourists in again, and I hope to see all of you here, because that needs to happen, because the tourist industry has it very, very, very tough. And obviously, you know, it's a big part of our Jewish identity is traveling to Israel. So I think that it will be more cautious than we expected. I think it will take slightly longer than we expected, but my prediction is that certainly by the summer, I would hope to see, more important from my point of view is tourists coming to Israel. But regarding your question, yes, certainly Israelis traveling abroad as well. I think that will be happening.
Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. A question that has been asked to me. This is a question really for Rabbi Freedman, but perhaps Nathan, you'll have some information about it from a specifically Israel point of view. If we've discussed the ethical imperatives, especially as it's becoming more apparent, please God will continue to do so, that the vaccination not only will protect the one immunized, but also start preventing transmissions. How do you feel from an ethical and moral and halachic point of view about compulsory vaccinations? Obviously, notwithstanding those who are exempt from whatever medical reasons. And then the question to Nathan would be, with Israel as a democratic country, think about that type of position as well. So for both of you.
Thank you. Sort of Herschel Schachter wrote recently that if a government is mandating vaccination, we should listen to the government's advice and the law and be vaccinated, which is a very strong position to take. From an ethical perspective, there is a strong dividing line in this country among ethicists about whether compulsory vaccination is a good thing. There are countries that practice an effective, I wouldn't say compulsory vaccination, but there are certain rights that you can't get if you don't vaccinate. So if you don't vaccinate your children, for example, there are certain countries that won't allow them into state schools. I think that's operational in France and other countries as well, if I'm not mistaken. My impression is that there is no appetite for anything like that in this country among most of the ethicists who I've spoken to about it, partly because of the culture here. We're not as sort of conformative to government rules and regulations as other countries are. So countries like China, for example, you know, they had a very strong response to the epidemic, and their response in terms of flattening the curve was very good, partly because, you know, normal Chinese people are quite frightened of authority because they have a much more draconian way of dealing with people who act illegally, whereas we don't. We have a much more liberal society and liberal culture. So people aren't used to the idea of being compelled or forced to do something to their bodies like that. It's much better. I think you get much more purchase through your population, through your public, by explaining and educating and giving people the autonomy, but showing the societal good that they can do, and also the personal good and the personal benefits that they will get from vaccination. So that has been my impression. I would be surprised if we even get to the point of vaccine passports, although the travel industry may well be the push to get some kind of vaccine passport, but I think that remains to be seen.
So that's really interesting. From the language you use, I would imagine that you support that position that you say majority of ethicists, that of using more of a carrot than a stick towards vaccination. And I wonder if there would be some type of divide, maybe from our different backgrounds, whereas I think for myself, consider it, if it's endangering other people, not to make it compulsory to the point where it's mandated, but there are certain benefits that you would lose by not doing it, because if you're putting yourself somewhere where you are going to put other people at risk, that has to come at a cost. But that would be my position on it, even though it does sound punitive and a bit draconian as well. But yeah, I
think the reason would be that if you get to a certain percentage of people who are vaccinated and therefore immune, and the vaccine does prevent transmission, it's a rather moot point, because you do achieve what the famous kind of herd immunity that people have talked about, which obviously protects people who can't be vaccinated, but would also protect people who don't want to be vaccinated. And while I said before, there is a dubious ethical position to take of someone who says, oh, I'm not going to be vaccinated because everyone else is. So I'm happy for everyone else to put themselves at risk, but I'm not happy to put myself at risk and get vaccinated. So that it's a very dubious ethical position to take, but from an epidemiological perspective, it might not actually matter.
Thank you. Nathan, do you want to comment on that from Israel, from what you're hearing?
No, I was just listening to Rabbi Freedman with great interest. It's fascinating.
But what about, have you heard whether Israel might make it compulsory, whether they might do that?
No, it wouldn't be viable for Israel to make it compulsory, I don't believe. I think that would be subject to high court challenges and all those types of things. I think even even giving privileges to people who have vaccinated may generate some controversy. And there's other kind of issues that are being raised here. I don't know if Rabbi Freedman actually has any perspective on them. Questions like, employers demanding that employees are vaccinated. What is the legal, what is the ethical stance towards that? Somebody who has a cleaner, for example, coming into their home, is it within their rights to insist that that person only works if they are vaccinated? The ethical, the legal elements of those, to which I don't actually have an answer at the moment, but I think those are...
Nathan, that has been discussed, and it's quite clear that employers would not have the right to insist that someone is vaccinated if the government hasn't insisted that anyone is vaccinated. So there was already a case here where a certain plumbing company said, even made up the phrase "no jab, no job," which was a great phrase, but actually will probably be challenged and will become an illegal position to take. So you will not be, no employer would be able to force an employee to have a vaccine in order to carry out their job. And I would imagine that the idea of giving privileges to certain groups within the population who have been vaccinated would also be seen as rather unethical.
Yeah, it's actually interesting. I know of a doctor who told me that a specific care company has paid their carers to get the vaccination because there was some hesitancy, and they paid about £50 just for them to get the vaccination, which is the other way of doing it. Over to the Bentleys.
I've got a question for Nathan. Do you think all the good work that the people of Israel have done in accepting the vaccine will be undone by your people on the other side of your borders? You're surrounded by people in Lebanon and Syria and Gaza and the West Bank who have not been vaccinated. And is that a danger for you?
That's a great and very important question, and one that actually reframes a very controversial issue, because we're hearing a lot about the question of Israel and vaccines for the Palestinians from all sorts of perspectives. And it's fascinating that you frame the issue of Israel's neighbors in this sense of what actually that means for Israelis, because it's very clear that the pandemic, we saw how it spread, that the pandemic is not limited to one place. The pandemic, you can't think of your own region isolated. And so Israel does have to think about its neighbors. Now, in terms of Lebanon, Syria, etc., there's actually very little flow of populations from these places to Israel. Ironically, it's much easier usually to get from Israel to London than it is to get from Israel to Damascus or something like this. So those particular neighbors, there's not a great deal of contact. Gaza is limited, but there is some. The West Bank, on the other hand, West Bank, Judea and Samaria, whatever we want to call it, we're talking about an area that there is significant contact. By the way, I think there's much more contact than any official figures would recognize, because a lot of people from Israel, especially among the Arab population that is less wary of going into Palestinian areas for security and other reasons, do go to the West Bank for shopping, to buy supplies, because things are cheaper. Also, among Arab citizens of Israel, that's about 20% of the population, there are family ties as well. So there is that kind of contact that's going on at the moment. Israel may not have herd immunity for some time, or we don't know exactly when. Children are not vaccinated, so if children are mixing, there is that kind of possibility of infection. The Arab community at the moment does have lower vaccination rates, so that is a real concern of a spread of infections from Palestinian people to the Israeli population. And what's so fascinating about that is it does kind of, give us a new perspective on the whole question of the vaccination of Palestinians. Is it an ethical or legal imperative? And maybe the rabbi has a perspective on that, but from a point of view of self-interest, regardless of the politics, putting the politics completely aside, is there an interest for Israel in the Palestinians of the West Bank being vaccinated? The answer there seems to be just kind of from an epidemiological point of view, certainly there is. So it's really good that you've kind of given us that perspective of putting us in a regional discussion.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Ben. I believe, I don't know if we have anyone else who has any questions because we're moving towards the end of our session. Does anyone else have something pressing that they wanted to bring up? Okay, fantastic. So guys, this is probably an opportunity before I close, if either of you have any last words that you wanted just to share with us to conclude your presentation. So Nathan, if you wouldn't mind to go first, please feel free to do so.
Yeah, I think, and I know it's a bit of a cliche in a sense, but I think the rollout, the development and rollout of the vaccine in such a short, record-breaking time, and I know this has been said before, I think really is a triumph of human cooperation, of dedication to science and what science can achieve. And I think that there's something very profound about, and I started by saying about my experience going for a vaccine, I think there's something very profound about being here, being in Israel, seeing Israel taking the lead on this, and really seeing kind of that human endeavor succeeding. We also have the Israeli vaccine that is in development, which will doubtlessly have importance too. And we could be speaking in a few months with a whole new presentation about what that vaccine is doing for the world, because that's going to be a one-shot vaccine probably. That's going to be a vaccine that won't require the cool storage, or the extent of cool storage that these need. And that could be a real triumph for developing countries. So we could be talking about a situation where Israel is vaccinated and Israeli vaccinations are really helping in Africa and elsewhere. So I would say this is an update on where we're at the moment. The pandemic is not over, but at the same time, Israel's inspiring role in trying to bring it to a close, I think, is also not over. So I think there's lots more kind of hopefully good news among all the inevitable sad news of the pandemic. I think there's good news from Israel to come over the coming months as well.
Brilliant. Thank you, Nathan. Over Rabbi Freedman.
Thank you so much. I think one of the questions I was asked recently in a Lunch and Learn is, what does God want from us right now? You know, what does all of this mean? And it's one of those questions where, you know, I would have to be a prophet to answer the question. I'm certainly not that. So the answer that I gave was that I don't think we can impose a global reason of what God wants from us right now and why we're all going through this. But what we can do is ask ourselves the question of, how are we going to be changed by this? What does it mean to us? How are we going to view things differently in life going forwards? And I think all of us now have a renewed appreciation for the fragility of life, of how interconnected we are to one another, of how we can't, as Nathan rightly said, from an epidemiological perspective, we can't just ignore other groups of people, even if perhaps they would see themselves as our enemies from an epidemiological perspective. We have to care for everybody. We have to look after everybody because we're all interconnected to one another and we're all relying on one another to be safe and healthy. And so moving forwards, I think this has changed all of us for hopefully the better in many ways, although we've also had to bear enormous tragedies along the way. And the true message that we take away from this has to be a very personal one. I have several for myself in terms of appreciating the work that teachers do, having to homeschool a number of children all at the same time while trying to work. I have a renewed appreciation for schools and teachers. I have a renewed appreciation for life itself, of tragically having to carry out a number of levayot. I have a renewed appreciation for the agility of my colleagues for transferring their communities online to be able to do events like this, which none of us thought we would be doing just a year ago, and ensuring that all of our members are connecting with HaKadosh Baruch Hu and doing the things that we did so well as communities now unfortunately separated and at home. So all of these things are things that are going to be permanent. And moving forwards, what does Hashem want from us? I think that's a question we have to all ask ourselves at this time.
Thank you, Rabbi Freedman. I'm going to take you guys both off of the screen, if that's okay, just to do some concluding words. As I said in the beginning, this would be a very important and meaningful evening. What I did not say in the beginning, and I had kept it to myself because I understood we were dealing with a very, very delicate area, COVID, and there's so much emotion and pain which is attached to it, that this evening would also be a good news story evening. Two individuals, Rabbi Freedman and Nathan Jeffay, who have been really at the forefront of the pandemic, and the various responses to the pandemic, including the vaccination, to hear their optimism, to hear their passion, to hear their enthusiasm. Hopefully that could give us a little bit of chizuk, a little bit of strength as well. These are dark times. There's no doubt about it, but there is still all the reasons for hope, all reasons to stay positive, all reasons to try to get the most meaning that we can through this difficult, challenging time, and to look towards, please God, a better time ahead. And thank you both for taking the time this evening to share some of your passion, your expertise, your knowledge, as well as your care for Am Yisrael with all of us, and greatly appreciate having both of you tonight. And on behalf of the community, we thank you so much for your presentations. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Going forward with our full calendar of activities, February seems to be a jam-packed month for exciting things going on. Sunday evening is our next event that we have coming up, the impact of Joe Biden on Israel. We will be once again going live to Israel to hear from Jeremy Sharon, who is the Jewish World and Religious Affairs reporter for the Jerusalem Post, who will be discussing all of what it means to Israel having a Biden now in the White House. We're looking forward to that. It will not be on a regular Zoom channel, however, so please check on Facebook or on the emails to make sure you go into the right one. However, come Wednesday evening, once again for our regular slot, 8:30 p.m., we will have something very different, and we'll be welcoming David Fishoff. David Fishoff is a rock and roll man. He literally is an agent to the rock stars. He founded and created Rock and Roll Camp. I know that you would think that'd be my creation, but actually it's his. We'll be speaking to the agent of Ringo Starr, to a man who worked with the Monkees and worked with Kiss and various other rock groups beyond all of his other activities. And he also happens to be a frum Jew as well. So it's going to be a very interesting evening, and looking forward to sharing that as well, including so much more which is coming up. Please make sure that you're registering for Purim, our virtual bingo event, to make sure that you get all of your all the items that you need, and you'll hear about all our Megillah plans as well. So much going on. It is 10 p.m., the end of our slot for this evening. So finishing directly on time is what we try to do. Thank you all so much. Hoping everyone had a very meaningful, enjoyable time. Thank you all for continuing to support our events, and wishing everyone a very good night, a good end to the rest of the week, and a very safe drive home. Have a good night, everyone.